Hi, this is Jennifer from Read It Again. Come sit with me while I read Part 2 of The Sunset Gates from the Unicorn Secret series by Kathleen Duey. Please consider subscribing, and if you enjoyed this book, hit the like button and share this video with all your friends. Tibbs had startled everyone. At first, the riders didn't react. Sprinting, Tibbs stumbled, then righted himself. Hart watched, amazed. Tibbs had to be scared witless. He had no chance of getting away. He couldn't possibly expect to outrun horses. In that instant, Tibbs swerved sharply and headed for the line of wagons. Before anyone could stop him, he had made his way through and was floundering in the tall grass on the other side. The wagons were close together, with children and old people standing between them. The riders reined in, furious. They couldn't get through. The man Benny had been talking to began shouting orders. The riders split into two groups. They galloped in opposite directions, riding along the line of wagons. Hart turned around to watch Tibbs. He had slowed down. The grass made it hard to run. Hart glanced at the riders. They would gallop to the ends of the wagon line, then turn and race toward Tibbs. He would be surrounded in seconds. As if he had heard her thoughts, Tibbs stopped. He turned and saw what the riders were doing. He looked around wildly, then ran back toward the wagons. Hart stared. He was coming straight toward her. She knew that a commotion close to the wagon might panic Moonsilver. The riders would hear him stamping and kicking. They would wonder why he was hidden inside the caravan. They might insist on looking inside. And if they did, Hart lifted her shawl to make a loose hood around her face, then stepped out from behind the wagon. "Kip?" The dog yipped in response. "Turn him," Hart said, using the herd dog command she had taught Kip. "Get him." She gestured at Tibbs. Kip leapt out, barking wildly, baring his teeth. It worked. Tibbs veered away, dodging through the little herd of loose horses, startling them into trotting a few steps. Avamere reared as Tibbs passed, making the riders' horses shy. Kip stayed close to Tibbs's heels, barking and snarling. Tibbs sprinted, his legs blurred by the tall grass. As Hart watched, he turned sharply once more, then stumbled and fell, sprawling flat. As the guards spurred their horses forward, he rolled over, flinging his right arm out as he scrambled to his feet. He ran again, heading straight away from the road. When the riders caught up with him, he stopped. He stood still as they circled him. He didn't answer their angry shouting. He did not want to run again. Hart called Kip back. He barked once, then sat, panting, pressing against her leg. The men got Tibbs up on a horse. One rider shook his fist, scowling. Tibbs hung his head, looking scared. He didn't even glance back toward the gypsy wagons. Hart was pretty sure he hadn't noticed her. She hoped desperately that he would think she wasn't with the gypsies any longer. The guards reined their horses around. The rider who had talked to Benny waved. "My thanks, old woman, for that free show when I was a boy. I'll repay you one day," he shouted. Benny waved back as the men galloped away. Hart stared after them. What would they do to Tibbs? Benny walked toward her, frowning. "You know the boy?" It was not a question. Hart nodded. "From Ash Grove. He was always mean to me," she sighed. "He saw the Dairytown show when Moonsilver saved Davy. I overheard him telling people Moonsilver was real. That's why I ran away." Benny's face hardened. She smoothed Hart's hair. "Don't worry. He won't cause you trouble. He has enough of his own to keep him busy." Settled back on the driver's bench of her wagon, Benny raised one hand and signaled the drivers to start. Hart fell into her place beside Moonsilver's wagon. Davy began to whistle quietly as they started off. Hart glanced back along the wagon line. Josepha and Talia were practicing dance steps, walking alongside Josepha's family. The sound of Zim's flute began. Hart stared at the flattened grass where Tibbs had fallen. A quick warm squeeze on her wrist startled her into gasping. She pushed back her sleeve. It had felt like the braided silver thread of her bracelet had tightened for a second, then loosened again. Hart stared into the tall grass, remembering the way Tibbs had flung his arm outward. He had thrown something. Hart drew in a quick breath. It all made sense. Tibbs hadn't really expected to escape. He had mostly wanted to hide something from the riders. But what? Hart walked closer to the patch of flattened grass, scanning the ground. There! There was something in the grass. Hart looked back at Davy. He was staring straight ahead. She glanced down the line of wagons. No one was watching. It was a book, a small, dirty, and tattered one. Hart scooped it up and tucked it into her dress pocket. Then she called Kip and dropped back to walk beside Moonsilver's wagon again. After a few minutes, Hart pulled the book from her pocket. If only she could read! She held it close to her chest and flipped through the pages. There were not as many words in this one. There were dozens of drawings. There were spirals and curves and complicated shapes. There were silhouettes of eagles and bears and... Hart stared. The lines were clear and dark, like the design in the book from Lord Dunraven's castle. The drawing was of two reared unicorns facing each other. Behind them was the setting sun. It was exactly like the drawing in Dunraven's book. It was the same design as the one on the blanket she'd been wrapped in when Simon Pratt found her. Hart was so startled, she dropped the book. She began to pick it up. Trembling, she put the book back into her pocket. Chapter 4. Jordanville had clean, wide streets. The buildings were made of white stone laid in rows like giant bricks. The gypsies set up camp on a wide, grassy place outside of town. Hart helped light the circle of lanterns for the show. The townspeople sat quietly while they waited. When the show started, Benny made them laugh at her jokes. Zim and Hart played their flutes for Josepha and Talia's lovely dance. The audience sighed. They applauded for a long time. They loved the jugglers. They shouted and clapped after the children did their acrobatic tricks. And when Avamere appeared out of the darkness with the goat's horn stuck on her forehead, the audience made a sound like wind sighing through pine trees. Hart had changed the act a little. Davy had gotten good at falling off the high wire, so they raised it a little. The audience gasped when he fell. Hart was always amazed at how much the act looked like a terrible accident. Hart began to play the soft, sad melody on the flute that brought Avamere galloping from the shadows beyond the lantern light. Her hoofbeats shook the ground as she circled. She plunged to a stop, rearing. Then she slowly lowered the goat horn to touch Davy's lips. Davy opened his eyes as though a unicorn had healed him, just like in the old stories. He stood up slowly, then bowed. Avamere extended one foreleg to bow beside him. The audience loved it. They stood up to clap and shout. Benny smiled and thanked them, then bid them good night. Zim and Hart played softly as the people left. Once the lanterns were out, Hart got her carry sack out of Benny's wagon. "Sleeping outside?" Benny asked. Hart nodded. "It's not too chilly, and I hate being apart from Moonsilver." Benny smiled, holding the candle lantern high so that Hart could see her face. "I'll feel easier when we are on the road and alone again, too." Benny climbed into her wagon, then came back down the little ladder holding a folded blanket. "Take an extra. Keep Kip close." Hart thanked her. "I'll let Moonsilver out for a while before I sleep," she added. Benny nodded. "Don't go far from the wagons." "I won't," Hart promised. She walked back down the long line of wagons. The stars glittered overhead. She let Moonsilver out. He shook his mane and trotted back and forth for a few minutes. Then he settled in and grazed beside his mother. Once he had eaten, he cantered across the field in the dark. A moment later, he came back, tossing his head. It had scared Hart at first, letting him gallop around at night. But he never stumbled. It seemed as if he could see perfectly in the dark. His hooves made less noise than a horse's. It was as though his whole weight never quite struck the ground. Once Moonsilver was safely back inside the wagon to sleep, Hart kissed Avamir's muzzle. The warm grass smell of the mare's breath tickled Hart's nose. "Good night," Hart said. Avamir touched her cheek, then paced away to stand close to the wagon. She lowered her head. Kip turned 3 circles. He lay down beside the wagon wheel. Hart smiled. No one would be able to get near the wagon without Kip and Avamir sounding an alarm. Moonsilver was safe for the night. She stretched and yawned. The grass smelled clean and damp as she knelt to feel for her carry sack. She pulled out a candle and Tibbs's book, then turned back the blanket. She hesitated, listening. Footsteps? Tssst! Hart slid the book into her pocket. Who's there? It had to be Davy or Talia or Josepha, but no one spoke. No one stepped out of the darkness. Hart shook her head. She had imagined the sound. Then it came again. Psst! Hart? It was a rough whisper. Kip stood up and faced the voice. He growled. "No tricks, Davy," she said quietly, feeling her stomach tighten a little. The moon was low and dim, and she couldn't see anything by the light of the stars. "Hart? Who is it?" she demanded, feeling her pulse quicken, afraid she knew the answer to her own question. Kip tilted his head, baring his teeth. The whisper came again. "It's me, Tibbs. Call the dog off, Hart. I just want to talk." Hart rested one hand on Kip's back. Had Tibbs seen Moonsilver grazing? Her pulse fluttered in her temples like birds' wings. She glanced at the wagons. No one was stirring. "Hush, Kip," she said quietly. Then she lifted her chin. "If this is some wicked trick, Kip will raise an alarm and—" "No need for threats, Hart," Tibbs said. "I came to beg your help." He stepped forward. Hart tried to see his face. Even this close, the darkness blurred his features. "I know the unicorns are real," he added, lowering his voice to a whisper again. Hart bit her lip. "We stick the horn to Avamir's forehead with pine gum," she began. "The colt in the wagon still has his own horn," Tibbs said. "I saw him," he sighed. "No one in Dairytown believed me." "Some did," Hart told him. "The guards have followed us and—" She stopped, blinking back tears. "Why do you hate me, Tibbs?" "I don't," he said quickly. "Not anymore. Ruth Oakes was my only friend. And then it seemed you were always with her, and I... Tibbs' voice stalled. "Why should I trust you?" Hart demanded. Tibbs looked up at the stars, then back at her. "Hart, if I travel alone, the guardsmen will find me. They ordered me back to Dairytown." He grimaced. "I had my master's permission to leave." Hart frowned. "Why would he give you his permission?" Tibbs hesitated. Hart could hear him breathing. "He knew why I wanted to come." Hart waited, but he said no more. She smoothed her dress. Her hand bumped the edge of the book in her pocket. She traced its shape with her fingers. "Can you read, Tibbs?" "Yes," he said, "and write. Apprentices have to learn." Hart set her jaw. "Teach me to read, and I promise to keep the unicorn's secret. I will ask Binny to let you come with us." "Agreed," Tibbs said solemnly. I give you my word, Hart." Hart pulled the book from her pocket. "Here," she said. "I found this in the grass." Tibbs reached out. He gasped when he realized what she was handing him. Hart leaned toward him to whisper, "What are the drawings?" "Metalwork designs," he whispered back. Hart tilted her head. "Fancy iron fences and gates?" "Yes," Tibbs said, excited. "And amazing castle doors. Beautiful suits of armor, all designed and made by the best smith who ever lived." Hart closed her eyes. Metalwork? It made no sense. Why would the embroidery design from her baby blanket match a drawing in both Dunraven's book and Tibbs's? "Why did you throw it?" Hart asked him. He let out a breath. "The book is the reason my master let me come. I bought it from a Derrytown junkman." Hart waited in silence until he went on. "My master wept when he saw it. He longs to meet the man who made these designs. All smiths do." Hart frowned, then realized he couldn't see her in the darkness. "Because he is so good?" "Yes," Tibbs told her. "You should have shown the book to the guards," Hart began. "They must know. They would have never let me out of lockup." Tibbs said simply, interrupting her. "That's why I threw it. Lord Ermadeath claims the smith doesn't exist." Hart shook her head, puzzled. "Why?" "So that no other lord will have swords and armor as fine as his." Join me next time when I read Part 3 of The Sunset Gates.